Captain Jessica Morgan had been flying F-15E Strike Eagles for 8 years, but she'd never felt the weight of discrimination quite like she did at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. The 4th Fighter Wing was still very much an old boys' club, despite the military's official stance on equality. Her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Hawthorne, made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in fighter cockpits. Every briefing, every mission assignment, every performance review carried the underlying message that she was there on borrowed time. The harassment was subtle but persistent. Hawthorne would assign her the least desirable training flights, question her decisions in front of junior officers, and consistently rate her just below the threshold for advancement opportunities. When Jessica requested transfers to other squadrons, her paperwork mysteriously disappeared or was returned with vague rejections. The other pilots, while not openly hostile, seemed to follow Hawthorne's lead in treating her as an outsider. Jessica's weapons systems officer, Captain Michael Torres, was one of the few who treated her with genuine respect. They'd flown together for 2 years, developing the kind of trust essential for operating a two-seat fighter. Michael often witnessed Hawthorne's condescending behavior and had privately encouraged Jessica to file formal complaints. But Jessica knew that whistleblowing in a tight-knit squadron could end her career more effectively than any discrimination. The turning point came during a routine night training exercise in late October. Jessica and Michael were scheduled for a low-level navigation flight, practicing terrain following radar approaches in simulated combat conditions. The weather was marginal, with scattered storms moving through eastern North Carolina, but well within acceptable limits for experienced crews. Hawthorne had personally briefed the mission, emphasizing that this was a critical evaluation flight that would factor heavily into upcoming performance reviews. As they launched into the darkness, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that Hawthorne was setting her up for failure. The mission profile was more complex than usual, with multiple waypoints through challenging terrain and strict timing requirements. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast, and she'd noticed some irregularities in their aircraft's navigation systems during pre-flight checks. When she'd mentioned these concerns to Hawthorne, he dismissed them as typical female overthinking and ordered her to proceed as planned. 20 minutes into the flight, as they approached their first navigation waypoint at 500 feet above the North Carolina mountains, disaster struck. A massive power grid failure plunged the entire eastern seaboard into darkness. Emergency frequencies crackled with reports of the blackout, and air traffic control centers began scrambling to manage aircraft suddenly flying blind over a landscape that had vanished into absolute darkness. Commercial airports switched to emergency power, but many smaller airfields went completely dark. For fighter pilots trained to operate in hostile environments, Flying without ground references was challenging but manageable. However, the blackout had created an unprecedented situation. Every landmark, every city light, every visual reference point had disappeared. Navigation aids were functioning, but the psychological impact of flying over what appeared to be an endless void was disorienting even for experienced crews. "Base, this is Viper 2-1," Jessica called over the radio, using their mission call sign. "We're showing the blackout extends beyond our operating area. Request immediate vectors to nearest available recovery field." The response was chaos. Multiple aircraft were requesting emergency assistance, and controllers were overwhelmed trying to coordinate recoveries to the few airfields still operational. Jessica maintained her composure as reports flooded the emergency frequencies. Aircraft across the eastern United States were declaring emergencies, fuel states becoming critical, and available landing sites dwindling by the minute. The scope of the blackout was unprecedented, affecting everything from major metropolitan areas to small rural communities. Air traffic controllers, working by emergency lighting and backup power, struggled to coordinate what was becoming the largest aviation emergency in American history. "Viper 2-1, stand by for vectors," came the stressed voice of the controller. "We're showing Seymour Johnson is on emergency power only. Approach lights and runway lighting intermittent. Alternative fields are Pope Army Airfield and Cherry Point, both reporting similar conditions." Jessica felt her stomach tighten. Landing a high-performance fighter on a darkened runway was dangerous enough under normal circumstances. With intermittent lighting and emergency power systems, it bordered on impossible. Michael, monitoring the tactical situation from the rear cockpit, provided a running commentary on their fuel state and navigation position. "Jess, we've got about 40 minutes of fuel remaining. Weather's still building to the west, and I'm picking up some concerning chatter about runway conditions at our alternate fields." His voice remained calm, but Jessica could hear the underlying tension. They both understood that their options were rapidly disappearing. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne's voice suddenly cut through the radio traffic. "All Viper flights, this is Viper lead. I'm taking personal control of recovery operations. Viper 2-1, you are directed to hold at Point Alpha until further notice. I have priority recovery for more experienced crews." Jessica felt anger surge through her, but she maintained professional composure. Even in an emergency situation, Hawthorne was playing favorites, relegating her to the back of the line despite her aircraft's fuel state and the deteriorating weather conditions. "Viper lead, 2-1 is showing 35 minutes fuel remaining," Jessica responded. "Request immediate approach clearance or vectors to alternate field." The silence that followed was telling. Hawthorne was forcing her into an impossible situation, gambling with her life and Michael's to prove his point about women in combat roles. 2-1, maintain holding pattern. That's an order, Hawthorne replied curtly. Jessica could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He was counting on her to panic, to make a mistake that would justify his prejudiced beliefs. Around them, other aircraft were beginning to declare fuel emergencies, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Michael leaned forward in his seat, speaking quietly over the intercom. "Jess, this is insane. He's going to get us killed to make a point." Jessica's hands remained steady on the controls, but her mind was racing. She had two choices: follow Hawthorne's orders and potentially run out of fuel, or make a command decision that could save their lives but end her career. The decision was made for her when the controller's voice crackled over the radio with urgency. "All aircraft, Seymour Johnson is reporting complete runway lighting failure. Approach lights are down, and emergency power is failing. Field is effectively closed until further notice." The implications hit Jessica immediately. Their home base was no longer an option, and fuel was becoming critical. "Viper 2-1 declaring emergency," Jessica announced, her voice cutting through the radio chatter. "Fuel critical, requesting immediate vectors to any available field." She had just openly defied Hawthorne's orders, but survival took precedence over chain of command. The controller, recognizing the gravity of her situation, immediately began providing vectors toward a small civilian airport that still had partial lighting. The civilian airport Jessica was being vectored toward was barely adequate for a small private aircraft, let alone a fully loaded F-15E Strike Eagle. Millbrook Municipal Airport had a single 4,000-foot runway, no control tower, and minimal lighting even under normal circumstances. With the blackout, only battery-powered emergency lights marked the runway edges, creating a narrow corridor of dim illumination in an ocean of darkness. "Viper 2-1, be advised Millbrook is reporting runway length 4,000 feet, no precision approach equipment and minimal lighting," the controller warned. "Emergency vehicles are responding, but their capabilities are limited." Jessica felt her pulse quicken. Landing a Strike Eagle required at least 6,000 feet under normal conditions, and that was with full runway lighting and precision approach systems. Michael was running calculations in the back seat, his voice tense but professional. "Jess, the numbers don't work. Even with minimum fuel and perfect conditions, we need at least 5,500 feet. This runway is going to be tight." Jessica understood the physics involved, but she also understood that they were running out of alternatives. Other aircraft were reporting similar fuel states, and the available airfields were filling up quickly. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne's voice erupted over the radio, livid with rage. "Viper 2-1, you are ordered to return to holding pattern immediately. I did not authorize your emergency declaration." His anger was palpable, but Jessica recognized it for what it was: a desperate attempt to maintain control over a situation that was spiraling beyond his authority. Negative, Viper lead, Jessica responded firmly. I have command responsibility for this aircraft and crew. Fuel state is critical, and I'm proceeding to the nearest available field. It was a career-ending statement, but Jessica had reached the point where survival trumped military protocol. She was gambling everything on her ability to execute an impossible landing. The approach to Millbrook required threading the needle between two significant weather systems while descending through clouds with minimal navigational aids. Jessica hand-flew the approach, relying on her instruments and years of training to maintain precise control. The turbulence was severe, shaking the aircraft and making instrument readings difficult to maintain. Michael called out altitudes and airspeeds, providing crucial backup as they descended through the darkness. Runway in sight, Jessica announced as the dim emergency lights appeared through the clouds. The sight was sobering. The runway looked impossibly narrow and short, a thin line of weak lights that seemed to end almost as soon as it began. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the sides, their flashing lights creating a surreal strobe effect in the darkness. Gear down, full flaps, Jessica called out, configuring the aircraft for landing. The Strike Eagle was designed for high-speed operations, not precision landings on short civilian runways. Every control input had to be perfect, every calculation precise. One mistake would result in an overrun, potentially killing both crew members and destroying millions of dollars of military equipment. As they crossed the runway threshold, Jessica could see airport personnel and emergency responders watching from safe distances. The media was already arriving, drawn by reports of military aircraft making emergency landings during the blackout. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness an extraordinary demonstration of pilot skill under impossible circumstances. 50 feet, airspeed on target, Michael called out, providing crucial altitude and speed references as Jessica focused on the runway ahead. The landing was going to be the most challenging of her career, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision to succeed. Jessica felt the main landing gear touch down with surprising gentleness, but she knew the real challenge was just beginning. The Strike Eagle's momentum carried them down the short runway at dangerous speed, and she immediately applied maximum braking and deployed the drag chute. The aircraft shuddered and groaned as every braking system strained against physics and momentum. Brake pressure good, chute deployed, Michael called out, monitoring the aircraft systems as they rapidly consumed the remaining runway. The emergency lights flashed past in a blur, marking their progress toward what Jessica hoped wouldn't be a catastrophic overrun. The mathematics were unforgiving. Too much speed remaining, too little runway ahead. Airport emergency crews held their breath as the massive fighter jet hurtled toward the runway's end. The local fire chief, a former Air Force veteran named Robert Patterson, later described the landing as impossible made possible through pure skill and determination. The Strike Eagle came to a stop with less than 200 feet of runway remaining, its tires smoking and engines winding down in the sudden silence. Jessica sat motionless for several seconds, her hands still gripping the controls as adrenaline coursed through her system. They had survived an approach and landing that should have been impossible, threading the needle between disaster and triumph. Michael's voice came over the intercom, steady but filled with amazement. "Outstanding flying, Jess. That was absolutely incredible." Emergency personnel immediately surrounded the aircraft, checking for fuel leaks and ensuring the crew's safety. Local news crews, drawn by reports of military aircraft landing during the blackout, began arriving to document what was quickly becoming a major story. Within hours, footage of the dramatic landing would be broadcast across national news networks. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne arrived at Millbrook Municipal Airport within 2 hours, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Jessica and Michael had been debriefed by safety investigators and were waiting for transport back to Seymour Johnson when their squadron commander appeared. His first words revealed the depth of his anger and his determination to destroy Jessica's career over her perceived insubordination. "Captain Morgan, you are under arrest for willful disobedience of direct orders and endangering military personnel and equipment," Hawthorne announced in front of the assembled emergency responders and media representatives. "Your reckless actions tonight will result in court-martial proceedings and immediate removal from flight status." The assembled crowd murmured in disbelief, unable to understand how a successful emergency landing could result in criminal charges. Robert Patterson, the airport fire chief, stepped forward with obvious confusion. "Excuse me, Colonel, but this pilot just executed one of the most remarkable emergency landings I've ever witnessed. She saved not only her own life and her partner's, but prevented the loss of a multi-million-dollar aircraft." His words carried the weight of professional experience and genuine admiration for Jessica's flying skills. Hawthorne turned on Patterson with visible hostility. "This is a military matter that doesn't concern civilian personnel. Captain Morgan disobeyed direct orders during a critical situation, endangering herself and others through reckless decision-making." His explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears, particularly in light of the successful outcome. Several members of the media had been recording the interaction, and Hawthorne's words would later prove devastating to his career and reputation. In attempting to destroy Jessica, he was inadvertently creating a public record of his own prejudice and poor judgment. Jessica maintained her military bearing despite the humiliation of being arrested in front of civilians and media personnel. She understood that Hawthorne was overplaying his hand, letting his personal animosity override sound judgment. The arrest footage went viral within 24 hours, sparking national outrage and intense media scrutiny of military leadership practices. Jessica's successful emergency landing during the unprecedented blackout had captured public imagination, while Hawthorne's decision to arrest her appeared vindictive and unreasonable to civilian observers. Military aviation experts interviewed by news networks universally praised Jessica's flying skills and criticized Hawthorne's judgment. Congressman David Reynolds, whose district included Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, called for immediate congressional hearings into the incident. Reynolds, a former Navy pilot himself, recognized that Hawthorne's actions represented a broader pattern of discrimination that undermined military readiness and effectiveness. His public statements defending Jessica added political pressure to the growing controversy. Captain Morgan exemplifies the professionalism and skill we expect from our military aviators, Reynolds declared at a press conference. Her successful landing during extremely dangerous conditions potentially saved lives and preserved valuable military equipment. The decision to arrest her raises serious questions about leadership priorities and judgment within the Air Force chain of command. Military social media communities erupted with support for Jessica and criticism of Hawthorne. Active duty and retired service members shared their own experiences with similar leadership failures, creating a groundswell of evidence regarding discrimination and retaliation within military aviation units. The hashtag #FlyLikeJessica began trending as pilots shared photos of successful missions and challenging landings. Internal Air Force investigations began immediately, led by Inspector General teams with expertise in leadership failures and discrimination cases. Investigators interviewed squadron members, reviewed performance evaluations, and examined Hawthorne's decision-making pattern over several years. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of discrimination against female aviators and retaliation against those who questioned his authority. Captain Torres, Jessica's weapons systems officer, provided crucial testimony about the events leading up to their emergency landing. His account corroborated Jessica's version of events and highlighted Hawthorne's reckless endangerment of crew safety for personal reasons. Torres described the fuel situation, weather conditions, and Hawthorne's refusal to authorize emergency recovery procedures despite clear safety concerns. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne deliberately placed our lives at risk to prove a point about women in combat roles, Torres testified. Captain Morgan's decision to declare an emergency and execute the landing at Millbrook saved our lives and preserved military equipment. Her flying skills that night were absolutely exceptional under impossible circumstances. The investigation also revealed that Hawthorne had been blocking Jessica's promotion opportunities and transfer requests through unofficial channels. Performance evaluations were consistently rated just below advancement thresholds, despite objective evidence of superior flying skills and leadership potential. Other female aviators in the squadron provided similar testimony about systematic discrimination and retaliation. Within weeks, the Air Force Inspector General's office announced preliminary findings that supported Jessica's actions and criticized Hawthorne's leadership. The arrest was immediately rescinded, and Jessica was restored to full flight status pending completion of the investigation. Hawthorne was temporarily relieved of command and placed under investigation for conduct unbecoming an officer. Public support for Jessica continued growing as details of the investigation became public. Veterans organizations, women's advocacy groups, and aviation professionals rallied to her defense. Speaking engagements and interview requests poured in, though Jessica maintained professional silence while the investigation proceeded. The case became a symbol of broader issues within military culture, sparking national conversations about gender equality, leadership accountability, and the need for systemic reforms. 3 months after the dramatic emergency landing, the Air Force completed its investigation and announced sweeping disciplinary actions. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne was court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, and creating a hostile work environment. The charges carried potential sentences including dismissal from service, forfeiture of pay, and possible imprisonment. Jessica testified at Hawthorne's court-martial, describing years of systematic discrimination and the events leading to her emergency landing. Her testimony was compelling and factual, focusing on specific incidents and their impact on squadron morale and mission effectiveness. The military judges were clearly impressed by her professionalism and restraint despite provocation. Lieutenant Colonel Hawthorne's actions that night endangered the lives of 2 aircrew members and potentially resulted in the loss of a $60 million aircraft, Jessica testified. His refusal to authorize emergency recovery procedures was based on personal animosity rather than sound tactical judgment. The successful landing at Millbrook was achieved despite, not because of, his leadership. The prosecution presented evidence of Hawthorne's pattern of discrimination, including blocked transfers, manipulated performance evaluations, and inappropriate comments about women in combat roles. Multiple witnesses testified about the toxic environment within the squadron and its negative impact on mission readiness. The case became a textbook example of how prejudice undermines military effectiveness. Hawthorne's defense attempted to portray Jessica's actions as insubordination that endangered military discipline and order. However, their arguments collapsed under scrutiny when aviation experts testified about the appropriateness of her emergency declaration and the exceptional skill required for the successful landing. The defense strategy only highlighted Hawthorne's poor judgment and inflexibility. The court-martial board deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Hawthorne was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 6 months imprisonment. The sentence sent a clear message throughout the Air Force about the consequences of discrimination and leadership failures. Jessica was promoted to major and received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her exceptional airmanship during the emergency landing. The citation specifically noted her extraordinary skill, courage, and judgment under extremely hazardous conditions that resulted in the preservation of life and government property. The ceremony was attended by senior Air Force leadership and received national media coverage. More importantly, Jessica was selected for assignment to the prestigious Air Force Test Pilot School, a career opportunity that had previously been denied through Hawthorne's interference. The assignment represented not only personal vindication, but also opened doors to advanced flying positions and potential future command opportunities. The squadron underwent complete leadership reorganization, with new commanders specifically selected for their commitment to equality and professional development. The toxic culture that had festered under Hawthorne's leadership was systematically dismantled and replaced with emphasis on merit-based advancement and mutual respect among all squadron members. Jessica's successful fight against discrimination inspired other service members to report similar situations. The Air Force implemented new policies for investigating discrimination complaints and protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. Anonymous reporting systems were enhanced, and investigation timelines were shortened to prevent prolonged harassment of complainants. Speaking at the Air Force Academy graduation ceremony 2 years later, Jessica addressed the incoming class of officers about leadership, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Standing at the podium before 800 newly commissioned Air Force officers, Jessica reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The auditorium was packed with families, distinguished guests, and senior military leadership, all gathered to hear from the pilot whose courage during a blackout had become legendary within military aviation circles. Leadership isn't about the rank on your collar or the position you hold, Jessica began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. True leadership is about making the right decisions under pressure, protecting those under your command, and having the moral courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. She spoke about the importance of merit-based evaluation and the danger of allowing personal prejudices to influence military decision-making. Her words resonated particularly strongly with the female cadets in the audience, many of whom had chosen military careers despite facing similar challenges and discrimination in their preparations for service. That night over North Carolina, I had a choice between following orders that endangered lives and making a decision based on sound judgment and crew safety, Jessica continued. The choice was clear, even though I knew it might end my career. Sometimes the most important thing you can do as a leader is to have the courage to do what's right, regardless of the personal consequences. The speech received a standing ovation and was later distributed throughout Air Force training programs as an example of ethical leadership under pressure. Jessica's story became part of the curriculum at professional military education courses, used to illustrate the importance of moral courage and the dangers of toxic leadership. 5 years after the Blackout incident, Jessica was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of her own squadron. Her leadership style, emphasizing merit-based advancement and professional development for all squadron members, became a model for other units throughout the Air Force. Under her command, the squadron achieved the highest readiness ratings in the wing and received numerous awards for excellence. The civilian airport where Jessica made her emergency landing erected a small memorial commemorating the event and its significance in advancing equality within military aviation. The Millbrook Memorial serves as a reminder that extraordinary achievements often arise from ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with courage and determination. Hawthorne, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his life after dismissal from the Air Force. His attempts to find employment in civilian aviation were hampered by his military record and the publicity surrounding his court-martial. Eventually, he found work as a flight instructor at a small regional airport, far from the prestige and authority he had once wielded. Several female pilots who had served under Hawthorne's command went on to achieve significant success in their military careers, many citing Jessica's example as inspiration during their own challenging moments. The ripple effects of her courage continued expanding, influencing military culture and inspiring a new generation of aviators to expect and demand equality in their service. Jessica's emergency landing during the blackout had lasted only minutes, but its impact on military aviation culture continued for decades. Her story proved that standing up to discrimination and injustice, even at personal risk, could create lasting positive change for future generations of service members. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won in combat, but in the courage to do what's right when no one is watching and everything is on the line. Today, Major General Jessica Morgan serves as the first female commander of Air Combat Command, overseeing the Air Force's premier fighting force. Her office walls display her Distinguished Flying Cross, alongside photos from that dramatic night at Millbrook Municipal Airport, serving as daily reminders of the principles that have guided her remarkable career. Her rise through the ranks was meteoric by military standards, but those who knew her story understood that it was built on a foundation of exceptional skill, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to excellence. Every promotion and advancement opportunity was earned through demonstrated competence and leadership ability, proving that merit-based evaluation benefits the entire military system. The changes implemented following Jessica's case have fundamentally transformed military aviation culture. Discrimination complaints are now investigated rapidly and thoroughly, with strict protections for whistleblowers and severe consequences for retaliation. Women comprise nearly 30% of military pilots, compared to less than 5% when Jessica first entered service, reflecting the effectiveness of systematic cultural change. Annual surveys show dramatic improvements in military workplace climate, with particular gains in areas related to gender equality and fair treatment. The Jessica Morgan standards have become shorthand within military circles for the expectation that all service members will be evaluated solely on merit and contribution to mission success. At Air War College, Jessica's emergency landing is studied as a case example of decision-making under extreme pressure. Students analyze not only the technical aspects of her flying skills, but also the ethical framework that guided her choices when facing conflicting loyalties between personal safety and military discipline. The civilian aviation community has also embraced Jessica's story, with the International Organization of Women Pilots presenting her with their highest award for advancing opportunities for female aviators. Speaking engagements at aviation conferences and pilot training programs continue spreading her message about the importance of equality and professional excellence. Robert Patterson, the airport fire chief who witnessed Jessica's landing, retired from emergency services but continues working part-time at Millbrook Municipal Airport. He regularly gives tours to visiting aviation enthusiasts, describing that extraordinary night when perfect flying skills and moral courage converged to create aviation history. Michael Torres, Jessica's former weapons systems officer, now serves as a squadron commander himself, having been profoundly influenced by witnessing true leadership under pressure. His own command philosophy emphasizes the same principles of fairness and merit-based evaluation that Jessica demonstrated throughout her career. The blackout that created the emergency situation was eventually traced to a cascading power grid failure, but its unintended consequence was exposing and ultimately eliminating systematic discrimination within military aviation. Sometimes the most significant changes arise from unexpected circumstances that force organizations to confront long-standing problems. Young women entering military service today often don't fully appreciate the barriers that existed just decades earlier, which is perhaps the greatest testament to the effectiveness of the changes implemented following Jessica's courageous stand. Her legacy lives on in the opportunities available to future generations of aviators who will never face the discrimination that once seemed insurmountable. The inscription on the Millbrook Memorial reads simply, "Excellence knows no gender. Courage recognizes no limits. Leadership serves all." These words capture the essence of Jessica's contribution to military aviation and serve as inspiration for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges with determination and integrity.